Hello and welcome to the latest episode of the Dialogue Out Loud series. I'm Taylor Petrey, editor of Dialogue, a Journal of Mormon Thought. Today, we're excited to have with us Kate Mower, who holds a PhD in modern European history and history of science from UC Riverside, and is now a postdoc in the Queering STEM program at the University of Utah. They are the current historian of Affirmation LGBTQ Mormons, Families, and Friends. In their recent article, Rule of Lawyers, LDS Entanglement in Eastern European Anti-LGBTQI Legislation, they explore the ongoing global political efforts of the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints to bar same-sex marriage, among other restrictions. The article not only uncovers important connections between LDS leaders, Russian and Eastern European oligarchs, and far-right religious networks in the context of anti-communism in the post-Cold War era, but also explores some important new themes in global Mormon studies. Kate, welcome. It's so nice to talk to you about your work.
Thank you. It's so nice to be here.
So let's start with the basics. You open with this anecdote that in 2017, you got an email from a Romanian Latter-day Saint about an upcoming referendum there to amend the Constitution to prohibit same-sex marriage. What was that event, and how did it launch your investigative research?
Yeah, so in 2018, Romania voted for this Romanian referendum. They voted, the referendum's language said that the Romanian Constitution wasn't working as it was written. And the way that it's written is that marriage is between spouses. And the Coalition for the Families wanted to rewrite the Constitution to say that marriage is between a man and a woman. And I think to a Latter-day Saint audience, that language immediately sparks some interesting thoughts, memories, especially for queer Latter-day Saints. And so I kept that kind of tucked in the back of my mind because it was established by this Coaliție pentru Familie, which is a Romanian organization. So I didn't initially see the connection to how this might be connected to something that felt a little bit more familiar, which would be Prop 8 in California.
So, to a little bit of a spoiler alert, you do discover that there are some connections that the LDS Church has to these groups and those who are behind it, and we'll uncover that as we go through. But it's important to note that this is in 2017, 2018, after same-sex marriage had been legalized in the United States, after it appeared that the church had sort of abandoned its efforts to prohibit same-sex marriage here, and yet we find them kind of running these same plays in other countries around the world in this post-Obergefell era, the decision to legalize same-sex marriage in the United States. So you sort of clocked this a little bit, and that begins the kind of your curiosity about all of it. But tell us a little bit about how the LDS Church gets involved in Eastern Europe to begin with. It's only been about 30 years in the post-communist era. What does that look like as the church has entered into this space?
So actually, the church entered into Russia and China, and I'm more interested in the Russian context before the Iron Curtain falls. So they enter in 1985. Actually, President Nelson goes to Russia in 1985. He has a whole story about how it feels like a miracle to even get in and to be able to talk with people. So from the get-go, the leadership in the church sees potential for networking in Eastern Europe, in Russia, and in China.
So they begin this relationship. Thanks for that reminder. They begin this relationship in 1985. President Nelson, or now President Nelson, Apostle Nelson, Elder Nelson at the time, is kind of leading that charge. And this begins a decades-long set of entanglements that the church has in these areas. So how did the church end up getting involved with the far right in these years?
So my research is generally Eastern Europe, and I look at queer topics in Eastern Europe, but that means I go to Eastern European conferences. So I was at an Eastern European conference where there was somebody who was talking explicitly about the Romanian referendum, and an organization called the World Congress of Families. Now, I had mentioned earlier the Coalition for the Family, which is Romanian. World Congress of Families, as they were discussing this, is an international organization. And so when I left that conference, I immediately dove in to see like who's in charge of this group. I don't know exactly what this group is doing. I know it in the context of Eastern Europe, but I don't actually know what's going on elsewhere in the world, especially in the United States. So it doesn't take a very extensive Google search to see that the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints is involved pretty extensively with this group. And as I was doing some more research, it was very interesting to hear how the Eastern European scholars were talking about the World Congress of Families and how Latter-day Saints were talking about the World Congress of Families, because those are two, like, they felt desperate. They felt very separate stories when to me they seemed to be overlapping. And so when the goal of this article is really to marry a lot of scholarship that's already taken place. There's so much scholarship on this organization called the World Congress of Families in the Eastern European context, and none of those sources mention the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints. So I felt my job was to show that there is a big player in this arena that isn't getting a lot of attention. So
let me just interrupt really fast to ask a follow-up question on this. So how are the Eastern European how does the Eastern European scholarship about the World Congress of Families typically represented? And as you say, you're noting that the church is also involved, which that scholarship had not noticed before. But what's the story that they were telling?
Yes, so they're telling the story specifically in this conference that I was at about the Romanian referendum. They were talking about World Congress of Families being heavily influential on that legislation, writing the legislation, putting it together, building an audience for it. The World Congress of Families in the Eastern European context was the main player for these scholars talking about it. And they're interested in it, namely because of this connection to the United States through a guy named Alan Carlson who's running the World Congress of Families, but it's also with the Russian oligarchs. So the Russian oligarchs are really, after the fall of communism, they're really invested in resuscitating a traditionalist approach to Russian history. They're trying really to rewrite a narrative or write a narrative that is quote unquote traditional. And so they kind of latch on to these thinkers that even were prevalent in under communism, like Sorokin and others, that they kind of latch onto. And then that is appealing to American far-right institutes and scholars, is I guess how you would label them.
So there are these kind of intellectual connections between Sorokin and he's actually, in my research, he gets quoted in General Conference in the 1960s and 70s. So there's this like intellectual tradition connecting conservative Russian thinkers with the American conservatives as well as a part of that broader anti-communist effort. But you're demonstrating that in the World Congress of Families, that gets funded by these individuals, these Russian oligarchs and other conservatives with the American religious right, that there's a kind of blending of those two interests at an institutional level in the World Congress of Families. Is that accurate?
Absolutely. And so it's an institutional level in Russia as well. The Russian Orthodox Church gets involved. Moscow State University is really the hub of this, the sociology department at Moscow State University. So it's institutionalized as well as motivated by individual interests of, say, oligarchs and others.
So you're talking about how the Central European, Eastern European scholarship is exposing the World Congress of Families as sort of being an organization of these Russian oligarchic interests, that there's a particular kind of conservative ideology of the family and tracing all of that. And you note that the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints is also deeply involved in the World Congress of Families. Tell us about some of those connections that you trace out and how you kind of see the church getting involved in the World Congress of Families.
Yeah. So there are several different ways, but the one I'm most invested in this article is through BYU's law school, the J. Reuben Clark Law School, and the professors at the J. Reuben Clark Law School have connections with the World Congress of Families, but also just in helping to mold constitutions around the world, not just in Eastern Europe, but around the world. They're helping to guide, I guess, is a way they might frame it, guide the constitutional framers and help them to think about the family, especially how you're going to write in family rights. And so this really begins with what Latter-day Saints think of as the miracle at Istanbul, which there's a BYU professor of law, Richard Wilkins, who goes to Istanbul, and it's a UN conference.
This is in the 90s, if I'm remembering correctly, right?
Yeah, it was 1996. Richard Wilkins goes to this meeting with the UN. And what is supposed to happen is he's just one of the many speakers, but he's confused for a Harvard University law professor. And so he gets put in this prime spot for a keynote speaker, as essentially a keynote speaker. And he doesn't quite know what to do. And what he does is present the Family Proclamation, which has just come out the year before. And that moment, the UN was supposed to be talking about how to make family legislation more inclusive for queer families. And instead, what happens is Wilkins kind of derails that, and nobody ends up signing the charter. Nobody ends up, this does not pass. The UN decides not to go forward with more inclusive family language in international conversations because there isn't a consensus, because Wilkins pulls a lot of states into his realm of thinking about the family. It's quite a moment. I wouldn't frame it as a miracle. I would frame it as devastating to LGBTQ legislation within the UN, and as the UN can frame things in international politics. But it kind of gives Wilkins and BYU's law school a platform to move into not just the UN, but into all of these other spaces. They are heavily influential in the UN, but then they go into lots of other avenues of interest, like building these constitutions.
This legal history is so fascinating, and it's one of the areas of global Mormon studies that I hope that we see more research on, about the church's political networks that they're engaged in here to influence legislation, constitutional writing, and so on. And the article is titled "Rule of Lawyers," and so you really do trace out a lot of these legal connections. Tell us a little bit about the World Congress of Families hosted in Salt Lake City.
So I would start with the World Congress of Families that was supposed to be hosted in Moscow. It was supposed to be hosted, so it starts out in Eastern Europe. It's the first conference is in Prague, and immediately there are Latter-day Saints who are presenting from the very first conference. But by 2014, there's supposed to be World Congress of Families in Moscow, and Russia invades Crimea the previous year, earlier that year. And so the Obama administration says, this is not going to work. You need to cancel, any Americans need to cancel this attending the World Congress of Families. They end up nixing the name, the World Congress of Families in Moscow, and they call it something like some other name about families, and all of the same speakers end up speaking. It still happens. But from that conference, it's decided that the next one would be in Salt Lake City. Now, that's the first World Congress of Families conference that is held in the United States. And so it's interesting that it's Salt Lake City and not a place like where Alan Carlson's from in, say, Illinois or something. It's in Salt Lake. And it's hosted by the church. The church has Elder Ballard speak at it. It is a formally church conference. So you have members of the 12 apostles who are meeting with members of the World Congress, prominent members of the World Congress of Families, who are sitting down with Alan Carlson, who is really the founder, the co-founder of the World Congress of Families. You have over the years, you have Dallin H. Oaks sitting down multiple times in public. The Deseret News reporting on this relationship between Dallin H. Oaks and Alan Carlson. And Dallin Oaks also holds an honorary membership of the board of the World Congress of Families. So these are some deep ties. It's not a coincidence that the first Congress is held in Salt Lake City in the United States.
So, and it's really, as you know, remarkable that the church helps to kind of rescue the World Congress of Families after because of its close entanglement with Russia. The church kind of rescues and helps in some ways to clean up its reputation and maybe solidify its own leadership influence in those years. And what years is it held in Salt Lake City? 2018?
2015, which is a unique year because the BYU Law School is sending amicus briefs to Congress to try to fight same-sex marriage becoming the law of land. So 2015 is a big year for it to be happening in Salt Lake City.
So within a few years after the church has really kind of put its own, taken over a huge role of influence in the World Congress of Families, the World Congress of Families is getting involved in anti-same-sex marriage legislation in Eastern Europe, using a lot of the same strategies of Prop 8, the legal language, the political strategies about constitutional amendments, the sort of propaganda campaigns that are engaged around all of this. So that takes us back to Romania. So catch us up just to sort of round out the end of the story about the relationship between the World Congress of Families, the church, and the Coalition on the Family in Romania.
Yeah, so the Coalition of the Family, so there are many of these organizations throughout the world, and you can kind of trace all of their lineages back to the World Congress of Families. The World Congress of Families really has such a heavy influence on all of these other organizations. And so it's very easy to kind of trace the genealogy of the founders of many of these. The one I'm most concerned about is the one run by Sharon Slater, and it's called Family Watch International. And Sharon Slater, if you listen to or read anything that she has written, she has said, I learned how to do this from the World Congress of Families. She is a Latter-day Saint. She runs this Family Watch International, and they are currently in this moment trying to make LGBTQ people illegal in certain countries in Africa, Uganda. So the laws that we've seen within the past 2 years in Uganda and Ghana, the most what's the word I'm looking for?
Inhumane.
The most inhumane of these laws are taking place right now because of this sort of lineage. And so, of course, the Coalition for Families is part of this lineage. You can trace them back to the World Congress of Families. So in the end, yes, my question was, did the church have any influence on this particular Romanian story? And the answer is yes, it did through the World Congress of Families. But it also does because you have several lawyers, several law professors at BYU's law school who are actively working on Romanian constitutional law. They're working with Romanian legislatures on these types of issues. So it's not just that the World Congress of Families is a mode to get these political actions done. It's also knowing the law and having these connections with Eastern European constitution writers.
There are so many more connections that you get into in the article. Thank you so much for joining us today, Kate. It's a huge pleasure to have you on the show to learn more about this important research. We hope that our listeners have enjoyed the conversation and have learned something new. If you'd like to learn more, check out Kate Mower, Rule of Lawyers, LDS Entanglement in Eastern European Anti-LGBTQI+ Legislation in the winter 2024 issue of Dialogue, and to explore other resources on this topic there. To our listeners, thank you for joining us today. If you enjoyed this episode, please share it with your friends and colleagues, and don't forget to leave us a review or get in touch with any comments or questions. We hope that you'll tune in for future episodes of our podcast. Please subscribe and rate the show, and be sure to check out the whole range of shows in the Dialogue Podcast Network.
Greetings, my name is Rebecca DeSchweinitz, and I'm thrilled to serve as a board member at the Dialogue Foundation and as one of the hosts of Dialogue Gospel Study. In each episode, which we record live the second and fourth Sunday of every month, we welcome esteemed speakers from a variety of backgrounds to share their insights and perspectives on the Come Follow Me lessons. Our aim is to spark meaningful conversations about the scriptures, to connect them to our personal experiences and to our understandings and explorations of the gospel. To stay in the loop with our upcoming lessons and this opportunity to engage with Mormon thought, culture, and belief, be sure to visit dialoguejournal.com and sign up for our newsletter. By doing so, you'll receive updates and timely links to join our live stream lessons. Additionally, you can catch up on our past guests and episodes by subscribing to Dialogue Journal on YouTube, Facebook, or wherever you listen to podcasts.
Dialogue Podcast Network.